Hello, my Welsh family. Today we're joined by Brian Sachetta, an author, blogger, and mental health advocate. After years of navigating his own anxiety and depression, Brian went all in on therapy, psychology research, and real life experiments to figure out what actually works. That journey eventually turned into his brand and book series, Get Out of Your Head, where he helps people take control of their mental health through practical, real world tactics. So today we're talking anxiety, depression, and what helps when you're stuck inside of your own mind. Brian, welcome to Welsh. I'm happy to have you.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm excited to be here.
So, for my listeners who are meeting you for the first time, what season of life were you in when anxiety and depression felt the strongest?
The strongest. Wow. Good question.
Just starting it off great. Right into the good stuff.
Let's separate the two out a little bit. So let me start with depression because that one is pretty specific. And I can point to my second book, which is called Get Out of Your Head, Volume 2, Navigating the Abyss of Depression. Not trying to plug that one too much, but just saying, like, I ended up writing that book as a product of this depressive episode that I went through in 2018 and 2019. And for me, like, I mean, I guess we can get into heavy hitting stuff real quick.
Please.
Is basically like I was at something of a turning point in my life. I would almost say it was sort of like going from still being a boy or a child and going through the gauntlet into adulthood a little bit of really coming to terms with the fact that like life is short and understanding that and on a real emotional level. And a lot of things arose in my life that kind of pushed me into that mindset, right? So I talk about these in the book themselves, but for starters, I was in this job. I didn't like the job at all. I couldn't find a way out of it, or I was trying, to interview at other companies and whatnot, but I wasn't having a lot of luck or success with that. And so day after day, I'm sitting at this job being like, I'm miserable, but I need to pay my bills and all of that. And so I ended up coming up with this narrative for myself, and I was like, if I can just get a new job and I can have more flexibility and more control over my schedule, I'm going to be happier or happy, kind of that narrative that people say of, I'll be happy when this thing happens, And then fast forward about like 6 months later, I actually like am in a new working environment. I'm doing consulting on the software side, and I kind of look around and I'm like, oh my goodness, I was telling myself that I'd be happy when I got to this place. I got this job or this, working arrangement. I'm completely miserable. I don't even know how I got here. And some of it was also like around that time. I won't go into the entire story because there's a lot of details to unpack here. But essentially, for some reason, I was just in the right/wrong headspace to like, I started reading a lot about climate change and just the way that the world was changing and all of that, and that sent me down such a big spiral to be like, I don't even like my life. I don't know what I'm doing, and yet like it sounds like the planet is on fire and we're all going to die in, even if it's 100 years, 1,000 years, whatever, like, but we're just doing horrible things to the planet. And I couldn't wrap my head around that, the idea of wiping mankind off the face of the earth, like that put me in such a spiral. And from there, going back to the idea of like, oh my goodness, my life is flashing by before my eyes. And I remember thinking back to all these different memories and saying to myself, like, wow, I'm, at the time I was 28 and I was like, I'm already 28. Like, how did that happen? The next thing I know, I'm going to be 60, I'm going to be 90, and I'm going to be dead. And I just went into this horrible, like nihilistic despair of thinking and saying, life goes by so fast. I'm not even happy now. Everything that I've tried to accomplish, nothing has really worked up to this point. Why even try? What is the point of life? And again, I kind of prefaced it a little bit in saying that that's really, really heavy stuff. And that was something that it took me a year plus to work through. And, I guess last piece on this, on sort of like my own, calculations or whatever was, around this time, my grandmother, who, she was 90 years old, she had been getting sick for a while, or she was sick for a while. She went into hospice, and I basically watched her deteriorate in front of me. She had dementia. I saw her become somebody that I didn't recognize anymore. And that was the piece that I really point to say, like, going from being a boy into becoming an adult and seeing like life is really, really hard. You're going to see the people that you love deteriorate or die And that is something that like everybody goes through, and it's just downright brutal. And that can put you again in that same headspace of what is the point of life? You know, if you just watch everybody that you love pass away and you have to go through all this suffering. And so, you know, I obviously pose those questions, but like I talk about them and kind of answer them in the book. And I think the important piece to call out there is that, one, you know, that is part of life. And two is that when you're in that headspace, those questions don't sound like they can be answered, right? You're always looking at them through the lens of your current experience. So because you're depressed, because you're in a bad headspace, you look out and you say, yeah, like life looks horrible. Like, why even try this? Why even do this, right? And so one of the core messages of that book is to say, remember that at some point, right? And it's not necessarily just a passive endeavor. Like you can also go out and exert agency in your own life and make change. But at some point, your life is going to change. Your mindset is also going to change. And then the lens through which you're looking at the world is going to change. You're going to then look out and say, oh, things don't look as bad anymore, and I don't even know why, right? It's because you have changed. And so all of that was very difficult for me to go through. And it's, you know, it's tough to talk about in a short window because it's a book that I wrote. That's pretty much the whole book. But a lot of the lessons there, right, were revolving around that concept of understanding that like depression is essentially the state you get into where you feel entirely helpless and you feel entirely hopeless. And so if you can take actions in your life that slowly start tipping the scales back in your favor to say, oh, I do have agency in the world. I do have some control over my own life. Life isn't just this horrible thing that I have no control over. Then that hopelessness and that helplessness starts to go away a little bit. You start seeing the world differently once again. And then kind of like the flywheel gets going and you're like, oh, I can make change. I can make my life a better thing. And yes, life is full of challenges and difficulties, but like I don't need to drown in them all day, every day.
Mm-hmm. I think what's so interesting is that drowning, like the way that you describe the anxiety and the depression in such a catastrophic, big picture, all-consuming mentality. And what that does then is it turns into difficulties in your day-to-day life. And so I'm curious because when we talk about it from the outside in hindsight now of, you know, what your spiraling looked like, how did that translate into your day-to-day? Like your mentality, your emotions, your habits, your relationships, like how did that, because I'm sure a lot of the time it's like you almost don't even recognize that, you know, it's just impacting everything in your life. So can you paint that picture a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit of you don't recognize it, and also your brain like won't let you recognize it, right?
Yeah.
You're too close to the problem where it's just the proverbial water that you swim in. And, you know, I quote that line a lot. It's from David Foster Wallace, and he basically says, you know, you have two fish swimming out in a pond or whatever, and one of them says, hey, like, you know, makes a reference to the water, and the other fish says, what's water? You know, and so it's just the milieu or whatever the term is that you are living in every day that you have become so accustomed to that you can't see it anymore. And so that is one of the most difficult things about anxiety or depression, one of these all-consuming conditions where that's why it becomes very helpful and critically important to start working with other people, right? Because when you finally start to talk about what is going on inside of you and put that on another person, I don't mean that in a negative way, but let's just say you work with a therapist and you say, here's my view of the world, here's what I'm going through every day, here's what goes through my mind. You then have somebody to bounce those ideas off of. And more often than not, right, especially if that person is helpful, they're going to be like, hey, in however they put it, right? I don't see the world that way. That's interesting that you see it that way. How did you come to see the world in that fashion? What should we do about it? What changes are we going to make? And what would be most helpful for you, right? Because again, you are living in your own ocean and you can't see it anymore. And so I guess concretely, like talking about my own experiences during that time, it really became like, for me, I would put the label on it, and my doctor did as well, was he kind of called it dysthymia, which I don't think that term is used anymore. I forget exactly the term that he's used. I want to say like low-grade depression, persistent depression disorder, something like that. But it's essentially, right, like for me, it was just day after day after day for a year or so, feeling down and hopeless and all of that, but still like living to an outsider from their perspective, still living a relatively normal life, right? Still getting up, still going to work, still going to the gym. And, you know, it was weird or challenging where like, it's one of those things where you think about it and you're like, how am I even getting up and functioning each day? And on the other hand, if I stop functioning, then I will completely collapse, right? It's almost the routine that is holding me together until hopefully something changes. And so I guess the last piece that I want to just touch on here is another sort of manifestation that occurred or arose during this time was, so for me, the depression basically like manifested in a OCD type fashion. Obsessive compulsive disorder in the sense of, so, you know, just for listeners who I'm sure a lot of them are familiar with this and probably struggle with it themselves, right? You essentially get these intrusive thoughts that you don't want to deal with, you can't deal with, you don't know how to deal with. And so then you start engaging in these different routines. These are your compulsions, right? In order to just try to manage the entire thing. And the craziest thing about OCD is it's basically becomes your brain's way of distracting you from the actual problem because it's too difficult for you to face in this exact moment. And so for me, the obsession became these ideas of, oh, you know, the planet is burning and life is meaningless and all these horrible things are swirling through my mind. The compulsion that I would do was then go say to myself, like, how do I figure out how to, you know, solve climate change, and just you just kind of stew on these things and ruminate on them all day, every day. And eventually you get to the point where you're like, yeah, these can be and probably still are very important issues, but let's be real. Like, I'm not going to solve climate change on my own. You know, that's crazy to think that. I can take actions that help me feel better about my own contribution to the problem, but that's really all I can do. And so eventually, right, you see that the OCD is distracting you from some real problem. And for me, you know, it was sort of like doing a lot of introspection and just deep thought work to say, essentially the problem is I have disconnected from my own life. I don't even like this life anymore. And my OCD of saying, I got to go fix all these big, big problems is preventing me from seeing the fact that there are many real problems in my own life that I actually need to address. And those are really scary to address because that means, you know, admitting to yourself that you don't like your job, admitting to yourself that the relationships you're in right now are not where they need to be, having serious conversations with people, talking about your mental health and all of that. And so it became sort of this very slow build back up to say, okay, I need to get myself back on the path. I need to rebuild my life. I need to be able to get myself in a place where I wake up and I'm like, you know, maybe not necessarily I'm juiced up about every day of life, but I'm walking on this path towards something that I actually care about. And then at that point you realize, right, or at least I realized that once I was back on that kind of path, the other problems fade away, and all of a sudden you see that they were a bit of an illusion, right? They were your brain's way of tricking you out of not seeing the real problems in your own life.
It's so interesting because I think that you take these, like you're saying, these big world problems, and we use them to convince ourselves that we are doing the right thing. And even if it's not the big world problem, like you use climate change, it could be, you know, your self-trust or your self-love or what you look like health-wise, that you think, okay, like I feel this lack of worth in myself. So I think that I'm going to fix it by going after this thing and honing in on this, you know, this other thing instead of looking inward and getting to the core root of that wound and getting curious about it and asking yourself, like, why do I feel this way? Where is this coming from? And so I think it really leads to this mentality that you think that you're helping yourself, but you're not. You're almost hurting yourself, I would say.
Yeah, it's so right. And yeah, just to hammer that home, it doesn't, you know, the obsession does not need to be something large at all. It just needs to be something that distracts you from the real problem. And that's the craziest thing, is when you look at that phenomenon, you're like, oh my God, like the human psyche is it's almost insane, right?
It
is. And I guess it does it as a protective mechanism, right? To say those other things are too difficult for me to consider right now, so I'm going to go think about these other things. But when I think about my own situation, I'm like, really? Was it really that difficult to be like, face your own life, get back on the path? Like going down the climate change and nihilistic path, like that sounds a lot worse, to be honest. So I don't know. It is very challenging, but yeah, it could be self-image. It could be any of those things. And it's really just comes back to the fact that like your brain wants to protect you from doing the work that you need to do. And maybe there's more layers to the onion there. Maybe it's like, hey, you got yourself into that situation because of the experiences you had as a kid, or, the way you were raised or whatever, where your brain won't let you go to those specific problems in your life and fix them. But I don't know, that is kind of what the literature bears out, is that's how OCD tends to manifest. And, sometimes there are just times where the brain does things that we can't really put our finger on it and say as to why. But that pattern, at least, that we just talked about, is a pretty common one.
Yeah, absolutely. So what do you think was the turning point for you? Like, what was the moment that made you realize, like, I cannot keep living like this, otherwise I'm going to go insane?
I mean, I knew pretty early on, like within the first 3 to 6 months, that it was really bad and that I was in a place that I didn't want to be. I think when I look back in hindsight, it seems cleaner than it was. I think we all kind of like whitewash memories a little bit. I think I almost got a little lucky, in the sense of, I remember, for example, like I was working on a contracting project and it just wasn't fulfilling. There wasn't a lot of work. I made money, and that was the tricky part, was like the client had very little work for us to do, yet they let us bill 40-hour weeks anyway, or at the very least they were like, we don't really want to know that you're not doing anything, research some stuff, come up with prototypes, whatever, bill normally. And look, I know it's a very first world problem, but like, that's what makes it so tricky, is your brain is saying to yourself, this should be a really good thing. I'm getting paid to not do a ton, and yet I am so profoundly miserable. Like, what is wrong with me, And so the luck piece that I alluded to was just the fact that, like, that contract ended and the client was like, no, we're not going to renew Brian's contract. And at first you're kind of like, oh, that stinks. Like, how am I going to make it, make income and pay the bills and all that? And it was just one of those things that life throws at you to say, like, and again, I'm not necessarily thinking this way in real time, but in hindsight, I'm like, okay, that contract ended. That forced me to go out and find another one. And that next contract was actually pretty good. Like, it was a part of a team that was close-knit and small, and we built a cool product, and we were all working together in this office, and we were having fun and whatnot. And so that luck piece was really just the ball kind of bouncing in a way that allowed me to see that things like could get better. And then once I had that reference point, I was like, oh, this is way better. I want something like this in every aspect of my life. I now am convinced that it's possible to get there. And so just being able to see that a little bit, I was like, I need to keep moving forward on all the different areas of my life and continue to rebuild it, rather than being stuck in that state of helplessness and hopelessness.
Yeah, completely. So then when you created Get Out of Your Head, what was that core message that you wanted people to stop ignoring?
So this is where, I guess, your original question of anxiety and depression, like, the two times at which I struggled most with these things, the brand actually arose out of the experiences with anxiety.
Okay.
And so that came first. Essentially, the journey was like, I struggled very hard with my own anxiety for a decade, and we could get into, like, and I really am happy to get into why, but let's come back to that if we want to. I struggled with my anxiety for like a decade. I had no idea what to do about it. It was 2008 when the journey really began for me. It's a very different time in the world, right? The internet is not the place that it now is. There's not nearly as much information out there on mental health as there is today. And also, like, being a guy in 2008, especially like a teenager, you did not talk about your emotions, right? So
Amen.
None of that helped my conditions at all. What I will say is, once I realized that I was dealing with anxiety, I spent the next 10 years saying to myself, this is the core problem that I have to figure out and fix. And, like, it wasn't necessarily every day that I had that narrative in my mind, but I knew, generally speaking, like that was the direction that my life needed to go. And so to answer the question of like, why do I have the brand say what it says, is I got to the point of, essentially saying to myself that like I was creating a lot of my own anguish through my own thoughts, right? And one of the main reasons for that, or one of the main routes to that, was like back when I was younger, and this comes back to the OCD piece too, is, something scary would pop into my mind. Let's just say like, I was potentially going on a date with somebody that I was interested in, and this thought pops into my mind to say, it's going to go horrible. You're going to have a panic attack on it. You've had panic attacks on dates before, XYZ. And then instead of just finding ways to regulate myself and say, yeah, okay, thoughts, you've come in and I understand that and you're difficult and I don't know exactly how to deal with you, but like, I'm going to go do something else. I'm going to put you off to the side. I don't need to resolve you necessarily, right? I basically, for a decade straight, just ruminated and ran these OCD patterns in my mind day after day after day, and created so much of my own anguish. And so at some point I got to this point to say, wow, like I've been running these patterns my entire life and they are so destructive for my mental health. If I can get out of my own head, if I can stop turning these thoughts over, that's going to help me quite a bit. And so, again, we can talk about specific parts of the journey if you want to, but around the time that I started writing the first book, I had something of like an epiphany. It was essentially like I'd been working on all these ideas and reading a lot of books and going to therapy and testing out different ideas for the last like 7-8 years, that kind of thing. And in this moment of stress that I was having, like a specific one, my brain kind of did this dumping where I was like going through a really anxiety-provoking episode, and I knew that I needed to figure out a way to get through the anxiety or manage it because I was just not in a great place. And I had this dumping where I was like, I pulled out my phone and I opened, the notes application. I just started writing everything down that was on my mind. And what I essentially was doing in that moment without realizing it was like everything that I had learned over the last 7-8 years just kind of came flooding out of me. And I basically started writing down all the things that I do to regulate myself, or could do to regulate myself when I'm anxious. And then I started using those things actively, like in my own life, to manage my anxiety. And eventually I cleaned that up and refined it and all that. And that kind of became the framework that is the focal point of my first book. And so to finally, put a cap on the answer, it's to say I got to the point of understanding that I needed to get out of my own head to make it such that my anxiety wasn't killing me all day, every day, and I wasn't contributing more to that anxiety because I knew I really was. Mm-hmm. And so at a certain point, I took all that information and I said, hey, this is essentially what has worked for me. Those that are interested in reading the book or listening to the audiobook or whatever, here is what might work for you as well, because these aren't just like, this isn't just me throwing the kitchen sink at you. This is like me having refined things and curated things and showing you what has been most helpful for me in the past. And hopefully, if you use those things, you can find a way to get out of your own head. And more importantly, like you can permit yourself to get out of your own head. Because I think for a lot of us, we say to ourselves, no, like we have to solve this problem.
Yes.
We have to solve the anxiety. We have to solve the emotion inside of us. And that's a very destructive path. And it's also one that you can go down so far without even realizing it and without even realizing how destructive it is.
Mm-hmm. And I think that happens for a lot of us self-improvement people, because really self-improvement is a good thing, but nothing is good in excess. And you can use it as a means to be self-critical and to try to fix a problem instead of getting to this place of self-acceptance and allowing yourself to get out of your own head in that way. Obviously, saying get out of your head is much easier said than done. And I like that you elaborate on the fact that you do have like specific refined practices that you use that were helpful, that will hopefully help other people. Can you give us, obviously you have to read the book in order to get all of those true answers, but I'm curious, like painting like a bigger picture, what getting out of your head actually means in practice. Like what are we doing differently?
Yeah, for sure. So I'm going to dive into this quick little framework that is like full disclaimer. I have been working on a revised edition of the first book. So some of this information is not yet in there. But some of the stuff that I talk about within the framework will be in there. So I guess let's just get into it. So the idea, right? Like we kind of talked about it already, is when you are anxious, you essentially need to find a way to regulate yourself. You need to be able to say, okay, I have this emotion going through me, and I need to find a way to work with that emotion and let it pass through me, right? Because what ends up happening is we close off, we resist that emotion in the form of saying that we don't want it to be present, in the form of looping over things in our mind and saying to ourselves, oh no, I'm visualizing myself failing or whatever, and I need to combat those thoughts, all that kind of stuff. So we need to regulate ourselves. How do we do that, right? As you mentioned, Sarah, like the challenging thing is you can know rationally that you need to get out of your head, but if you're just sitting there being like, oh, I got to get out of my head, like that's obviously not very helpful, And I don't take it as criticism, but I look at it myself, and as I've gotten older, I'm like, yeah, like I still like the name of the brand and all that, but there are times where it can feel a little dismissive, to be like, you just got to get out of your own head. Like if phrased in that way, I could totally see that. But it's really just meant to be a reminder to self to say, okay, I'm doing that thing and I need to get out of my head yet again, because that's what's going to be helpful for me. I'm not trying to actually downplay it. So let's get into that little framework that I was alluding to. It's called the IRA framework. So what this is like breaking down the acronym. So first we need to interrupt the anxiety or the anxiety spiral. Then we need to reframe the threat of whatever the anxiety is telling us is threatening. And then we need to anchor back into calm. And there's a reason that we need to do all of that, right? One, like really getting into the meat and potatoes of it is when we get what I will say is hijacked by our anxiety, essentially what happens is the amygdala, which is, part of the limbic system in the brain, detects some threat and says, we are in danger here. And then it starts secreting different messages to send different hormones to different parts of the body, which eventually release adrenaline and cortisol, the stress hormones that say, you need to fight with or run from this threat that we have perceived. And the most challenging thing about that whole process is the fact that hardware, as in like the amygdala and the adrenals and all of that was all designed a very, very long time ago when we were facing different kinds of stressors than we are today, right? That system is really designed for combat with ferocious animals or, warring tribes in the wild. Mm-hmm. It is not built for staff meetings and dates and job interviews and that kind of thing. And the real reason for that or the real difficulty behind that is, so when people say, you're stuck in fight or flight, if you think about being in front of, a ferocious predator, you really do have those two options. And sometimes people will say you can freeze as well, right? Mm-hmm. So you can either, like if there's a lion in front of you, you can fight with the lion, mm-hmm. or you can run for your life, or you can freeze. And what's going to happen is one way or another, live or survive, that altercation is going to resolve itself within a couple minutes max, Mm-hmm. And so you look at the acute stress response, the fight or flight response in the body, and that it is what it is wired for. That is what it is designed for. Again, not those job interviews and whatnot. Mm-hmm. And the challenge is you look at, let's say, a job interview, one that you really care about, a job that you really want, and you think to yourself, the interview is a week away. I can't run away from that other than canceling it, which I don't want to do. I can't fight with a job interview. I can't freeze from a job interview. I'm just scared that I'm going to go into this thing and bad things are going to happen. And now I have an entire week with just me and my thoughts and my acute stress response that is revving the crap up, right? Mm-hmm. So I give this primer to really jump back into the framework and say, okay, the first piece, the I, is interrupt the anxiety spiral. So what does that really mean? What that means is we need to find a way to take back control from our amygdala and So essentially, like, get the threat response to turn off or at least power down a little bit. And the real tricky piece with this, and this is where get out of your head comes back in, is when the amygdala hijacks you, your prefrontal cortex, which is the foremost part of your brain involved with emotional regulation and planning and critical thinking and all that, that gets turned off. And it makes sense, right? If you're in front of a tiger, you do not have any time to think critically. You need to fight with that thing, or you need to get the heck out of there. Therefore, if your amygdala has hijacked you and your prefrontal cortex has gone offline, you really can't get out of your head. It's very, very difficult. The deck is stacked against you. And even though that sounds daunting, the real message here is, let's go back to the I, if you will, and say, interrupt the anxiety spiral. How do we do that? We need to reconnect to our physiology and use our bodies in ways that align with how they were designed. As in, okay, yes, I have a job interview that's coming up in a week, and it's very scary, and I can't run with it, I can't fight with it. But I know the way that my body is designed, I know the way that cortisol and adrenaline move through my body, and I know the messages that they are trying to send to me. Therefore, rather than trying to fight this thing mentally, rather than trying to turn things over again in my mind, which we've already proven can't really be done under amygdala hijack, I need to tap back into my physiology. I need to treat this job interview as if it were a live tiger that is sitting in front of me. And what does that mean? That means I can either go move my body, as in I can get up off the couch, I can go for a walk, I can go for a run, or I can tell my body through my physiology that I am safe. And how do I do that? There's two main ways. The main ways are deep breathing, so getting a deep exhale. And I guess science shows that when you get that deep exhale, the fight or flight response tends to calm down a little bit. And the opposite of the fight or flight response, or I guess it's the parasympathetic nervous system, comes back online. And that is the calming division of your autonomic nervous system. So you want to get that deep breath and send that sign to your brain that tells your amygdala that it can stand down a little bit. So once you've done something like that, right? Once you've moved your body, once you've done some deep breathing, another way that you can do this is, you could either splash some cold water on your face, or you could move your eyes around. You're really trying to tap back into your physiology to tell your brain that things are okay and that you're not actually in front of a live tiger right now. So that is the I, if you will. So again, this is the IRA framework. We move on to the R from there, and we say, okay, now that my prefrontal cortex has come back online a little bit, and I actually can think critically, that part of my brain is available to me once again, I can now reframe the threat that is in front of me. And it doesn't necessarily need to be that we look at that job interview and we say, hey, it's no big deal. Instead, what we can do is we can look at it and we can say, let's just be real. Let's think about it. I am nervous about this thing because I care about this job. I want to walk out of that interview having done a good job, and eventually I want to get, an email or a phone call from the company that says, congratulations, we're giving you an offer. I am scared that, one, I might not get this job. Two, I might embarrass the heck out of myself in the interview and look like a complete idiot. Three, I might not have any other prospects available to me if I fail this interview, and therefore I may never get a job, right? So all that negativity is swirling in our minds.
And if I may, and what does that mean about me as a person? Like, how does that now define 100%. Who I am?
Yep. And so going back now to the R, right, is we need to take a strategy or a tactic that is in our toolkits and say, how can I use this to reframe that threat? Now, obviously, we could just do sort of the, rational thinking through that I'm going through right now, or we could potentially use some sort of specific tactic that I call out in my book, for example. And why I'm, to give a little bit of context as to, how this framework fits in, why I'm talking about all this stuff is, in my first book, I have this framework called the 10 Steps to Getting Out of Your Head. Those came out of that anxiety brain dump that I alluded to 5-10 minutes ago. And the 10 steps to getting out of your head are meant to be categorized to say, these are your I's, these are your R's. Wow, my camera just zoomed in on me real close. These are your I's, these are your R's, these are your A's. So when you find yourself in the middle of that anxiety, take an I, take an R, take an A, run through that process, see how you feel, do it again, do it again, do it again until you have regulated yourself. So I'll kind of put a pin in the R, as in reframe the threat, because, leave something for folks to chew on. And also I think in general, we kind of get the message as to like, all right, yeah, PFC is back online, got to reframe the threat now. That makes sense. Mm-hmm. And then finally, once we are pretty much there, or we're getting close to being regulated, we then want to go to the A, which is anchor into calm. And that is essentially just taking one of the feel-good strategies that you have in your toolkit and saying, for example, right? Like at this point, I'm feeling pretty good. If I go through the whole process real quick, I'd say, all right, I'm feeling nervous about the job interview. I got up off the couch. I went for a walk. I did my deep breathing. I tapped back into my PFC. I reframed the job interview in the sense of, I now realize that even though my brain tells me I'm standing in front of a tiger, I'm not. And yes, this job interview is very important to me. I'm scared about it. I care a lot about it. But let's be real. This is not a life or death matter. It's important, but it's not going to kill me if something bad happens. And finally, I'm then going to say to myself, this is just an example of one of the A tactics, right? So anchor into calm. I will say to myself, I'm remembering that I have been through many situations like this in the past, and I always feel as though the anxiety is never going to go away, and yet here I am. This is probably my 30th job interview. Mm-hmm. And guess what? I thought I was going to die before all the other ones. I'm still alive. Mm-hmm. What does that tell me? That tells me that this too is going to pass. And so I start saying that to myself as if it's a mantra. And then I look back and I say, how am I feeling now? Do I need to go back through IRA yet again? I keep doing that until I feel better. And obviously, if it's not working, we don't want to just hammer it to death. But like that is the first line of defense. That's what we want to walk through as soon as we have the awareness and we catch ourselves being in that looping thinking.
Yeah. Okay. I'm obsessed with this. This is incredible. So essentially you're noticing the feelings, you're noticing the all-consuming feeling that you're experiencing. And then you're almost using get out of your head as a mantra. Like, cause I like how you talked about the, not being dismissive. You're not saying like, oh, just suppress the feeling and get out of that mentality. You're saying like, okay, now my next step as a mantra is I'm going to have to get out of my head. And I'm going to do that by implementing the IRA method. And then you head into that. I love that. So I'm curious then, because I feel like a lot of what happens is there's this difference between the feeling of anxiety, just like the feeling of anger or embarrassment or shame or whatever, and being an anxious person as an identity. And I feel like that's, where the difference comes in a lot of the time, is that we say to ourselves, or almost use the anxiety as a crutch to say like, well, this is just how I'm going to go into this job interview and this is what my experience is going to be because I am an anxious person, compared to being like, okay, I'm feeling anxiety and now I have to interrupt that pattern, replace it, and anchor back into calm. So can you speak to that difference at all?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely can. I think it's a good call out. This is not meant to be flippant at all, but the thought of, and I've absolutely been there before as well, to say like, I am an anxious person. Mm-hmm. To me, that if I hear that from someone, again, it's not meant to be dismissive, but two things come to mind at once. The first is making that separation or distinction that you just talked about. And the second is being real with where we're at and saying to ourselves, if I say that I am just an anxious person, I'm always anxious, that kind of thing, again, not dismissive, but to me that says we do have a lot of work to do, right? Mm-hmm. And so we can hold both ideas in our minds at the same time, even though they are a little bit counterintuitive. And we can say, I'm going into an anxiety-provoking situation, seeing myself as a very anxious person. And even though I have a lot of work to do, that doesn't mean that, like a lot of work to do in the grand sense, that doesn't mean that I'm doomed in this specific situation. Mm-hmm. So I would look at that and I would say, we now need to do whatever we need to do to get through this situation right now. And some of that is actually reminding ourselves that that label that we attach ourselves to is disempowering. Mm-hmm. And some of it is also remembering that like we're not, Rome wasn't built in a day. We're not going to just be like, I'm a super anxious person and I woke up the next day and I have no anxiety, right? This is something that we have to work on. And so that's what goes through my mind, is being honest with yourself, but also being compassionate with yourself to say, here's where I'm at. It's not necessarily the best place in the world, but I'm going to work on it, and all is not lost in this exact moment. And I think like when people, it sounds cheesy, it really does, but so much of this battle is built up, or I guess a big piece of dealing with this battle effectively is having compassion for yourself, right? Because when you go down into that spiral of I'm no good, I always fail, I'm super anxious, why me, whatever, like that's bad. That is, you're going down a bad path. And I again, I don't say that to be critical. I just say like you are taking away some of your own power, right? If you can just sit there and say, yes, I am an anxious person. I own that. I don't enjoy it. I struggle with it, but I don't need to hide it, and I'm going to figure it out. Isn't that a lot more empowering than, talking down to yourself incessantly?
And just the fact that at the end of the day, you are the only person that knows everything that you've been through, knows why your mind works the way it does, and can have your own back better than absolutely anybody else. So even if it is at this maybe mentality that you're at, this point that you're at, feels delusional to have your own back in that way, it really just does come down to the idea that like, okay, like I acted in that way with the knowledge that I had at that point, and I am okay. I am a good person. I know that I'm always trying my best, and I know now that I have more knowledge, even if that knowledge came 2 seconds later, and I can implement that in the next endeavor that I take. And you mentioned because we're talking a lot about anxiety, and I liked at the beginning that you separated the anxiety and the depression, because what I think is, we have those like, all-consuming spiraling analyses of everything that we do and how we do them and why we do them. And it turns into what you just mentioned, is that feeling of doom. And is that where the difference between depression and anxiety is? Like, is that what's hard about depression compared to anxiety? Is that hopelessness?
Yeah, so I guess just to put the definitions back on the table, anxiety is fear, but it's future oriented, right? Because again, talking about the tiger, yes, you can very well be afraid in front of a tiger, but when you have a job interview that's a week off, there is a distinct difference there, and it's that timepiece. So it's the same feeling of fear, but it's abstracted out into the future. And that is what is so challenging for us, is our brains and our bodies are not designed for off in the distance threats. They are designed for immediate ones. So the key piece to anxiety being fear and time. Depression, as you mentioned, is more akin to helplessness and hopelessness. And so one thing that I will say is they are very different things, yet at the same time, people will often say they are like two peas in a pod, or they are comorbidities in the sense that they tend to appear together. And there's theories as to why. Some of it could be related to neurotransmitter activity, methylation in the brain and all of that, in the sense of, if your serotonin and dopamine is not, the amount that your body is secreting and holding on to, or your brain is secreting and holding on to, is not at normal levels, then maybe, all of a sudden you start having general mood disorders or issues with your mood, right? Which could be anxiety, could be depression, that kind of thing. And I know anxiety is technically not considered a mood disorder, but if you think about it, right, it's like your brain is making you feel a way that is not great. And in that sense, that could be anxiety, that could be depression, whatever. The real thing I wanted to get to in terms of the comparison is a lot of people say that there's a common pattern to having anxiety and then experiencing depression. And to put it bluntly, it's essentially continually being scared crapless. I'm going to try to give the PG version. And then eventually experiencing that fear for so long that you fall into that helplessness, right? So you're like, I'm scared. and I don't know how things are going to change. And then all of a sudden, something clicks in my brain as to say, I've been so scared for so long, and things have not gone the way that I want them to go. Why am I even trying? Why am I even trying to change anything? Right? And you fall into a state of learned helplessness, which there's some research there, Martin Seligman and whatnot. People basically, have said over the years that learned helplessness is very akin to depression or a precursor to it or whatever, right? And it's that state in the mind, that groove that you get stuck in where you say, I don't see how my behavior or my actions could exert any change in the world. So why act? Why behave? Why try to change? Let me just lay down and take it, And so that is a common pattern. And I think a lot of folks find themselves in that. And, it doesn't necessarily need to be exactly that way. But it makes sense, right? If you're constantly scared and things aren't going your way, you're going to reach some tipping point where you start to question whether or not you should really even be trying. And that is a very difficult place to be because, at least with the anxiety, right? And I'm not trying to make light of anxiety. Anxiety is very difficult. But a lot of the times when we are anxious, there are like good things on the table. They may be hidden from view. They may be out of sight, whatever, but they're usually there, right? As in, okay, I'm really anxious about this job interview. Yeah, I don't want to experience the anxiety, but there is some possibility that I actually land the job. That's a good thing, right? Whereas with the depression, you kind of fall out of that possibility, and all of a sudden you're like, again, why even go to job interviews? Why even try this stuff? So that becomes a bottom point, and from there, it's like, how do you bounce off of that bottom point, and where do you go from there?
Yeah,
it's
completely. Hard. Absolutely. I love the way you explain that. I think because it's so, we do hear them almost kind of go side and side, anxiety and depression. And I think the way you just illustrated it almost makes it feel like, the anxiety happens until you reach this point that now you're in this depressed state. And so what can we do to stop it before it gets there or get out of it once it's already there? So for you in your journey, you're at that point. You've been chronically anxious. Now you're depressed. You haven't reached this get out of your head era of your life yet. So you immerse yourself in therapy and psychology literature. I'm curious, what ideas started to change your perspective, started to change your life?
I feel like they're all interwoven in what we have talked about thus far. The main one that, the first one that I go back to that I think of all the time is the fact that, I talk about this in my first book, was I grew up in a household, we liked the idea of The Secret, if you've ever heard of that book, the law of attraction and all that. And look, I like positive thinking. It's nice to think positive and all that. But I think I took that. I guess what I would say is there is danger in positive thinking
100%.
And the law of attraction. And also, it wasn't just The Secret, there's other books too. I mean, that idea is infused into the space entirely. This was the story that I talked about in my first book that I just alluded to was, so I go off to college. I had just, essentially I struggled with dating in high school. I was very reserved. I was very anxious. I was part of a group of friends that we were like jocks, but I didn't want to tell anybody that I struggled with these things. And so I essentially just pretended as though everything was fine. And yet I was really, really struggling all the time. And so I finally started getting into dating my senior year of high school. And I go on this date with this girl that, we had been on a few together and I'm interested in, but things don't seem like they're going well. And long story short, I have a panic attack on this date and the relationship ends. And for me, I mean, I think for anyone, especially at 18, that's a very difficult experience to have, especially when your brain says, I am just getting started with dating and things are going horrible. How am I supposed to keep trying? If, again, the early association of if your brain makes that link to say anxiety equals panic attack, dating equals anxiety, dating equals panic attack, dating equals failure, dating equals heartbreak, so on and so forth. You're like, what am I supposed to do about that? That's very difficult. my brain is telling me that I shouldn't keep trying and making me feel as though I'm just going to drive off the cliff again and again. And so I spent the next 6 months just ruminating relentlessly over this experience and trying to figure out, like, how do I get my body not to do that again? And I had no idea, like, what I was doing. At that point, I didn't know anything about psychology. I didn't even know the term anxiety. I was just like, I was so nervous on this date that I couldn't think straight. My heart flew out of my chest, XYZ. And so I go off to college, and first couple weeks I meet this girl that I like, and I think we hung out in group settings or whatever. And then one night she's like, I'm going to come over. And she had been drinking. I hadn't, and she's very animated in a bad way. And essentially, like, I'm trying to catch my breath because I know that I'm going to have a panic attack, or I'm afraid of that because I just spent the last 6 months worrying about that. And I'm like trying to catch my breath in the hallway. I'm walking up and down, the hallways in the dorm. And she kind of surprises me because I thought she'd be over in, 20 minutes, and she came over very quickly. She's like, oh, hey. And I'm like, oh my goodness, I'm so nervous. I don't know what to do right now. And there's this chair in the study lounge or the hallway where I'm walking, like right behind me. So I'm like, all right, let me just lean back into the chair, try to catch my breath and be cool or whatever. And she jumps into my lap because she's been drinking, and she like feels like my body shaking, and I'm like having this panic attack. She does not take it well at all. And she gets up and she's like, what the F is wrong with you? You're a freak. Get away from me, whatever.
What?
And I'm like, oh my goodness, here we go again. Like, this sucks. Mm-hmm. And so I essentially wake up the next day. I'm like in despair. Like, here we go. Here's 2 of those really bad events for me, for my nascent dating life in a row. I have no idea where to turn. I don't know what to do. And I went on the internet at that time. I alluded to this earlier, of the internet being a much different place back then. I was on like random people's websites buying ebooks for like $45 through PayPal. It was the wild, wild west on panic attacks and anxiety and all that. And I'm like trying to synthesize as much info as I can real quick. Mm-hmm. I'm like, okay, that was a panic attack. I struggle with anxiety, all that. And so a lot of these books, they went along the same line of thinking as Law of Attraction, The Secret, whatever. And they're like, you have to visualize the outcome that you want in your mind. You have to see yourself achieving it. And it's only then that you can actually bring that outcome to life. And so I basically took that as gospel for 10 years. And that's what really drove my OCD, or at least like that was a big driver of it, right? When I'd be going on a date and I'd be really nervous, I'd think back to that logic and I'd say, I have to visualize myself being on this date and having it go well and not being nervous and whatever. And every single time that I did that, do you know what happened?
I'm scared. Tell me.
No, just that my anxiety got worse.
That's
right?
what you were going to say.
Think about things that scare you.
God.
There's never a point at which you're like, I thought through it fully and I'm good now.
Yep, 100%. That's what I thought you were going to say. See, and it's so aggravating because it does make sense that if you can picture it, you can make it a reality, but nope.
Yeah,
doesn't help.
And I do, I obviously talk about this in my books, and I'm like, look, if that works for you, that's awesome. If it legitimately 100% works, you keep doing that.
Yeah.
But for most people with anxiety, it really does not work, and it's actually very destructive.
Yes.
And so, you this is my long-winded way of answering your question. You had asked, like, what did I find most helpful, whatever. The biggest breakthrough I had early on, and when I say early on, I mean like in the first decade, the first true breakthrough I had was, if you want something, you don't need to see it in your mind. In fact, you can actually put it out of your mind entirely and just go do the thing. Your subconscious mind is powerful enough to do that. In fact, a lot of people, right? It's, you see it in pop culture or whatever. Like, I always think of the movie Old School, and obviously it's a comedy and it's not a real movie. It's not real life, but they're in this competition where they have to do athletics and trivia and all that. And Will Ferrell gets up there and he gives this like long-winded speech in response to a question that the judge asks him, and then he passes out. And he like wakes up and he's like, what happened? I blacked out. And it's like, I know it's a joke. I know it's a comedy movie, but that's actually kind of the spot that you want to get to. You know?
Okay.
Your brain can do that for you. It can deliver you that experience. You want to walk into that speech, that interview, whatever, be like, I don't even know what happened. My brain put me on autopilot. I came out on the other side. I didn't think about my anxiety, and man, it didn't go that bad. And so for me, that was like mind-blowing to be like, I do not have to sit at my desk every day, run these loops, fuel my OCD, and fuel my anxiety. I can just put it out of my mind. It is not irresponsible to do so. I can just let it go do other things. And guess what? The world is going to keep turning.
Mm-hmm. So is that where the self-experiments came in? Like, what was the self-experiment that had the biggest impact on you?
I mean, with the experiments, like here's the general gist was I would read a book or listen to a cassette or whatever, or I'd go to therapy and I'd
A cassette is crazy,
idea.
Brian.
I know. Yeah.
Just
Back then you had to do whatever
It's
you had to
true.
do. It was like all this, Audible was not a thing yet. There was cassettes, there was CDs, and I'd rip them onto my computer, and then I'd find ways to like get them on my iPod that were totally janky, but like you had to do what you had to do.
It's true. It's true.
It really was the wild, wild west. And I essentially just got to the point of saying like, well, you know, it wasn't always methodical. And some of this was born out of the fact that I didn't actually want to talk about my mental health a lot, right? Again, 2008, macho men,
Right.
the world's a very different place. I didn't even talk, like the first person who ever knew about any of this stuff was my mom, and it came like years after the original experiences, you know? So I essentially was like, well, if I can't really talk about it, then, or if I'm not going to allow myself to talk about it, then I'm going to consume as much information on the subject as I can, or a lot of information, you know?
Amen.
And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, what are the core ideas that this person just talked about? Let me use some of those ideas as I go into anxiety-provoking moments and see what sticks. And then from there, that's kind of my curation, right? Where what is left in what, like when I talk about my 10 steps to getting out of your head, that framework in the first book, like all of those tactics are things that I experimented with and found were helpful. And everything else got trimmed. Or a lot of it got trimmed because I'm like, I didn't feel as though this was that useful. So it's gone.
I think that is the most impactful piece of that, is that you're right. Like you're listening to all the things, you're watching all of the things, you're reading all of the books, you're consuming all of the information that you can in an effort to try to help yourself. But I think a lot of what happens is that we look at, like, let's say the book is like, let's use yours, follow these steps, get out of your head, you'll be free and cured of anxiety and depression. And that's not the case. You know, like it's that you have to trim and find what works for you, that someone can use all of your methods. And because you've refined your methods, a lot of them, I'm sure, are really helpful and do work, but maybe all 10 of them don't work for every single person flawlessly. So being able to decide and decipher what works for you and what's applicable to your life and what you've experienced and how your brain works is huge. I'm wondering, kind of going more into like Wellish's whole idea, just that like this is realistic self-improvement. We don't anticipate to get through the whole book and have this, we've crossed this threshold and now we're in this space of perfection, clear head, unbothered, nothing affects us anymore. So what does doing this work look like in progress? And what does the day-to-day look like maybe for you now or while you were in the midst of your, like, we'll call it a recovery period?
For sure. I guess two quick things that I just want to cover is,
Yeah, please.
One, it is definitely a problem with the self-help industry in general of making promises we can't keep, right? If I write a book and I'm like, and that is, you will be able to tell there is a lot of frustration in this answer, is a lot of it comes down to marketing.
Yes.
You will see these books get marketed as the cure, the solution, the silver bullet. I got a newsflash for you. There's a field called psychiatry. There are hundreds of thousands of psychiatrists in the US. 20% of the population is on some kind of psychotropic drug. There are all sorts of interventions and therapies and modalities and all of that. Like people are throwing all this stuff at the wall. We are as sick mentally as we have ever been. There is no silver bullet. Let me put it there. That's it.
Mm-hmm.
In my books, and part of the inspiration or motivation to update my first book was understanding that, okay, I'm 35 now. I wrote the first book when I was 26, 27, published it when I was 28. I was still a kid at that point. And I did, maybe make some promises or some high, like I maybe oversold some things. And I'm a little bit more realistic now, and I want that to come through in the pages. And so I'm making things more grounded, making things, dialing back on some of the promises or the overstatements or whatever. And one thing that I really focus on in that book, even the original edition, is saying, hey, like, not everything is going to work for you. That's exactly how it goes, right? If you look at any specific intervention or treatment plan or whatever in the mental health space, most of these things are coin flips at best. And that is the most frustrating part is, you talk to somebody who says, oh, have you heard of CBT or ACT or whatever? It did wonders for me. And then you go try it yourself and maybe it doesn't work, right? And so it's just challenging where we still, like, as an industry, we need to humble ourselves and say, we are actually pretty much living through the dark ages of mental health. We don't know so much. There is so much that we don't know and we have not figured out yet. For me, right, my message is not everything that I throw at you is going to work, but the reason that the entire title of that book is called Get Out of Your Head, a Toolkit for Living with and Overcoming Anxiety is that when the reader reads that book, it's not my toolkit that they go take. It is their flavor of that toolkit that I want them to walk away with. So I'm going to throw 30 ideas at the reader throughout the course of that book. And I want them to walk away from that book with 4 or 7 or 11 tactics that work for them. And I want them to discard the other ones. And that is the most important thing that I think anybody can hear. Because I go back to, Brian at 18, and I think to myself, I read all these crappy ebooks and I got all these bad ideas and I held on to them firm for a decade. I wish somebody told me I didn't need to do that. That would have saved me undue anguish. Now, I know you asked an actual question and I didn't answer it yet. So can you repeat the question?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm wondering what does it look like in progress? Like, what does anxiety and depression look like when you're in that repair process, or what it looks like for you now, since it's not like you have some magical moment that you're perfect?
So it's a good question. Why don't we start with depression? Just because I actually depression is a beast and it's so difficult, but I actually think it's like slightly cleaner in terms of the work. And I'll tell you why. We go back to the idea of you are depressed, you are helpless, you are hopeless, or you're in those states. The only important thing when you are depressed is that helplessness and that hopelessness resolves itself by 1% or 0.1%, maybe not every day, but on a regular basis, right? So what you're really trying to do, I used this term earlier, is there is some flywheel in your mind. We'll call it the flywheel of hope. I know that sounds absurd, and I should be my own marketer that is making promises he can't keep. But if you're that helpless and you're that hopeless, your flywheel is stuck and you are at 0, right? There is nothing telling you that things are going to improve. What you need to do is, picture it as if it were like the wheel on Price is Right, or one of those wheels they spin at conferences with all the little dots on them that you can win prizes on and that kind of thing. Picture like each peg, right? Like the wheel ticking past each peg. You want to try to get through a peg every day or every week. You just want to see that flywheel is having any kind of motion in it. And what does that look like, right? The core ingredient or the core driver of that flywheel is agency. So what does that mean? Agency is essentially an understanding that the effort you exert can actually make some amount of change in the world. And we have to be realistic with ourselves. We can't sit here and say, oh, well, I'm depressed, but I'm going to go start a $1 billion company and I'm going to be a billionaire tomorrow, right? We have to say, look, like, level with ourselves. be honest about where we're at and say, okay, yesterday I couldn't get out of bed. I stayed in bed all day. My goal today is to do something that allows me to get out of bed today. And then from there, right, just baby steps, right? Okay, yesterday I got out of bed and I did something for an hour. Tomorrow, let's try for an hour and 15. Or I didn't shower yesterday. Today, I need to shower. And if I shower, I'm going to write it down and give myself some credit for that. And each time that you give yourself some credit and say, look, like I'm doing things that are, again, we're not changing the world necessarily, but I'm very, very slowly moving my life forward and doing things that I couldn't do yesterday, that flywheel starts ticking. And then from there, right, you keep adding to it. So for example, maybe you got out of bed, you took the shower, you say, I'm going to go for a 20-minute walk today. And then the next day, 22 minutes or 21 minutes or whatever. At some point, you say, I'm going to put a video game on, or I'm going to play a video game, and I'm going to try to beat one level, right? What you're really trying to do again is you're trying to see that the actions you're taking in the world are actually giving you positive feedback. And once you have that positive feedback, your eyes open up a little bit, right? The possibilities reappear to you. And you say, my flywheel is moving. Maybe it's not moving that fast. And hey, maybe it will slow down tomorrow. But I now have evidence that I can make change in my life. And so you're really just trying to stack all those little wins day after day after day after day, and hoping that the dark clouds that are hovering over you are slowly moving until one day you look up and you say, wow, I didn't even realize how I got here, but the clouds are gone, the flywheel's moving, and I feel as though I have some agency back over my life. And that is really the high level battle with depression. Now, I will say that if there's some deep psychiatry work, some psychotherapy that you need to do that is, bundled up in that, which is most likely the case, then sure, I would recommend working with a therapist, doing some introspection, doing some journaling and all of that. But at a very high level, that is the goal, right? You are depressed, most likely. Now, like, obviously there's many ways we can become depressed. Like we could lose somebody. We could have a dysregulation of neurotransmitters in our brain and all that stuff, right? But all you're trying to do is allow your brain to see that you can change your life very, it might be methodical, it might be slowly, but you can do that, right? And once you have sight of that life that you actually want to live again, you'll have some hope. You'll be like, oh, that's what I'm moving toward, and that's why I'm moving, rather than the mindset of saying, why do anything? It's all going to be for nothing. Does that make sense?
100%. So let me throw this at you. You've got the flywheel moving in the direction. You didn't get out of bed. Now you got out of bed. Now you got out of bed and you did something. Now you did something and you moved a little farther in progression. Obviously, we know growth isn't linear. We know that sometimes you do regress. Now suddenly I'm not getting out of bed again. So what are some signs that someone is still genuinely getting better even though they have that bad day still?
I mean, it's a great question. I really do think it's very subjective,
Yeah.
but I think that that's okay in the sense that, like, as long as the person who's going through it is leveling with themselves and checking in with themselves, they're going to catch it. They're going to find it, right? So that's why I think like something like journaling, or even it doesn't necessarily need to be like journaling as in my diary. It could be like when I go to bed, I write down 3 things. And I'm going to make these up, but like I write down a few things, right? And so it's, how did I feel today? Do I feel better or worse than yesterday? What did I accomplish today that helped me feel as though I was making progress? And what is my overall outlook, right? And then maybe at the end of the week, review those notes and say, oh, okay, this was one of those weeks where I took a step back. What do I need to do now? And another important piece here, right, is like, remember that like you're not alone in this, or you should not be alone in this, in the sense that like you need a support system. If you don't have it, I'm sorry that you don't have it, but that's very difficult to go through, right? It's not kumbaya, like, oh, you need all these people. If that means somebody that you trust that you can talk to, if that's a parent, if that's a sibling, if that's a good friend, you need somebody like that. Might be a therapist, whatever. you need other people to, again, bounce those ideas off of and see what sticks to them. If you are talking about your experience and saying, hey, well, I was feeling good last week, but like this week was a bad week. Like if you find somebody that you can trust that actually supports you, they're not just going to say, oh, it's okay, like things will get better, right? They're going to level with you and they're going to be like, okay, well, that sucks, but like, what did you do last week that you found helpful? And like, what do you want to accomplish or achieve in your life? And, or at the very least, like, where do you want to be a week from now? And, you know, what are the kinds of things that excite you? What are the kinds of things that would get you out of bed? Like, could we do any of those things? I'm not saying they're all achievable immediately, but like, let's try to give you some, you know, some wins here. Let's try to make sure that we're stacking the deck in your favor. And so it's not pretty. It's really actually like in the weed stuff of checking in with yourself a lot and being honest with yourself and all that. But like you said it earlier, like you're the only one who knows how you feel. And so you need to remember that is actually, I know it's at times it seems like your worst enemy because you're like, I feel helpless, I feel hopeless, whatever, but that's your compass, right? And so if you're checking in with that compass, you don't want to do it every minute of every day, but if you're checking in with that compass on a regular basis and then like expressing the emotions that are, you know, coming from that compass, if you will, probably, I don't know.
I get what you're saying. No, not at all. I totally get it.
It's going to point you, right? It's going to keep pointing you. So concrete example, you're like, well, this week didn't go so well and that sucks. And now I feel helpless and lost and I don't know what to do. Okay, go back to your support system and say that. And then they're going to, you know, act as something of a mirror or whatever and say, okay, you feel helpless and this week didn't go well. Like what would make you feel better? What are the things what does Brian want to do? What does Sarah want to do? And again, not on the grandiose sense, but like, where do you want to be in a month? Where do you want to be in 2 weeks? How do you want to feel? What are the little actions that perk you up and bring you joy in your day? And so it's really getting down to brass tacks like that and being honest with yourself and just muddling through it until you get to the other side. And I wish that I could say it was sexier than that. It's not. It is hell. Like it is real bad. But yeah, that's how it goes. And lean on the support system that you have. If you have no support system, I beg you, like find a way, you know, like join a men's group, a women's group, a book club. If therapy is not affordable, you know, maybe talk to, you know, ChatGPT, something like that. Like find yourself a tool that is accessible. Like that is, you cannot be the only person, the only thing that is going through this. You can't go through it alone because unfortunately you are in that water, right? You are swimming through depression and you can't always see it day to day, but other people can, and they will support you if you give them the chance and you speak honestly to them. And that's really the work that you have to do. And the hardest thing is that it is so difficult. Like I'm going to say this. I don't know if this is bad or not, but I'm like, some people would rather not be here at all than open up to that level and be that honest with people. That's how difficult it is.
You can't get out of your head by staying stuck in your head. You have to physically get it out into the world to bounce the ideas off of other people. That makes complete sense. Cool. So to wrap us up, I like to play a game with my guests. I call it Kinda Toxic, Kinda Well. Essentially, what the game does is it highlights my guests' humanity, since you guys all seemingly have it all together. But what I think is cool about it is that you are normally really healed. So you either A, give really good answers, or say, I genuinely don't experience that emotion, and it creates this idea for people that it is possible to get to that point. So whatever you feel called to say, please, anything is, you know, on the table. So I have 8 more rapid fire questions if you're down.
Let's do it.
Okay. What or who are you jealous of right now?
I have a lot of answers. I'm trying to decide how candid I want to be.
Candid.
I am jealous of I'm not trying to put my life story on the line, but I'm like, the last few years of my own life have been very stressful, and some bad things financially have happened. And I now look around and I look at other folks who got lucky let's say, right? Because in some ways, some of these things are luck, right? You go work for a company, the company goes public, they had some shares in the company, and it's just a matter of luck that you're at one company versus another. I am jealous of those folks because the last few years have been a ride, and my body has been through a lot. And I wish that I could be like, hey, I got lucky, and I can write full time, and I can do these things that I care about. The writing, the podcasting, this is nights and weekends work for me. I would love for it to be full time. Unfortunately, I'm not in a financial position to be able to do that. I am jealous of people who can do stuff like that as a result of, maybe some of it was hard work, but there's always some luck involved. And the luck has not been with me just yet. So hopefully in the future.
Amen. What's a moment recently you caught yourself either ignoring your own needs or choosing yourself instead?
This is tough. The reason it's tough is I've done a lot of therapy in the last year. And one of the core patterns that came out of the therapy was that I have actually pretty much ignored all my emotional needs for my entire life. Like I have, me and my therapist, we essentially call it the emotional janitor problem, which is I come around with my bucket and I make everybody else feel okay. And I never talk about my own emotions besides in my books or on my podcasts. And what that essentially means is like I put everybody else's emotions first rather than my own. And even when I walk into a situation where I'm like, I'm so anxious, or I really don't want to do that, or I'd really rather stand up to this person and say, listen, dude, kick rocks. I put their comfort and safety first. And I do that a lot. And that is now something that is like the core work that I need to do. And hopefully at some point will be the product, or it will result in a third book. So we'll see.
Amen. What do you find yourself overthinking about these days?
Finances, for sure. I would love to put myself in a position where I can write and I can connect with more people. And life is just so expensive these days.
It's so true.
I don't want to get on my soapbox and go down a rabbit hole, but I'm like, I live in Boston. The cost of living in Boston is insane. If you talk to most people, like I make a good salary at my job. There is still no, and a part of it is I'm single. So like if I was in a relationship and we had two incomes, that's different. But there's no line in sight to me buying a house anytime soon. And I'm 35. I'm not 25, right? So I know a lot of people who are listening feel they're in the same boat, and it's very frustrating. You go to family parties and all that, and they're like, when are you going to buy a house? When are you going to settle down? And you're like, Grandma, when you bought your house, it was $10,000.
Yes.
Today it's $1.5 million $1 million
for the same house
job of a house.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
So anyway, that's where I'm at.
What's an expectation that you've put on yourself that you've either let go of or that you still need to?
What comes to mind for me, and these were all kind of recent phenomena, right? Is like for the last 3 years, I worked myself like a dog, like going to work, being stressed out at work, taking on more work at my company than I could reasonably do without losing my mind. And then coming home, working out, working on my books, writing, podcasting, marketing, all that. There was a point, I think it was somewhere within the last 1 to 2 years, but more specifically in the last year, I got to the point where I said to myself, I need to preserve my sanity. And if that means cutting way back on all these extra activities, writing, podcasting, marketing, whatever, that's what I need to do. I will come back to them at some point. But right now, I'm not doing myself any good if I keep trying to push through. It's only going to get worse. So my focus is drop all that stuff, preserve my sanity, figure it out another day. And obviously we're podcasting today, but I am now picking and choosing so that way when I finally get to that place where I'm not as stressed out and I have more time, I'll get there faster and it'll be better.
Yeah, 100%. What's something that makes you quick to get annoyed or angry?
One thing that I hate is cigarette smoke.
I love that
So
answer.
if anyone is within, like, if anyone's within 30 feet of me smoking a cigarette, I get so mad.
Love that. What's a toxic thought you still catch yourself believing?
I don't know, because I'm like, I don't have like that unrealistic of expectations to be like, oh, that's why I think that's crazy. But probably on like the negativity side, right? There are times where, I don't know, like there'll be a relationship, whether it's at work or at home or whatever, and like I'll just it and this will make some sense, right? Is like the emotional janitor pattern. It seems like it serves you because you're like, I'm keeping the peace and things are all good and whatever. And then something happens, right? Where there's an altercation, there's an argument, whatever, and somebody else is in the wrong. And rather than me speaking up and being like, you can't say that. You should not do that. That is wrong. I hold it in, and then the toxic thoughts become me stewing about that problem for the next week rather than just having addressed it in the first place. And I'm being vague because, like, I don't want to. There's some things that are just not at liberty to talk about necessarily. Maybe in a couple of years or whatever. But I think to myself, I'm like, not all of those situations are ones where you're like, I can definitely, like, there are reasons why I might not always be able to speak up in those situations. Maybe if it's your boss, that's really difficult. You know what I mean? I'll put it at that. But there is also like kind of two sides to that argument, right? Is yes, there are places where you can't speak up, you can't say things, and then you fall into the toxicity. But then also that pattern becomes ingrained in you and you start making excuses for yourself in situations where you could speak up. And so for me, it's trying to figure out, redraw that line and that boundary and actually start asserting myself in a respectable way. So that way I don't get to those toxic thoughts as often.
Completely. What's a wellness rule or trend you don't buy into?
I mean, it's visualization. We talked about it earlier, right? It's like, it's never worked for me. If it works for you, that's awesome. But I would just strongly caution against it, especially if somebody is listening and they deal with anxiety. Those two things do not mix.
Yeah. If you could leave my wellish friends with one piece of advice that would leave them more well than toxic, what advice would you give them?
It would be around like, the high level is like, I love you. I'm sorry what you're going through. If you're going through difficulties, my heart goes out to you. I'm right there with you. The lower level would be, once you get to the point of like, I don't say this in a cheesy way. I really don't. Once you get to the point of owning what it is you're going through and removing the shame from it, that's when you can actually move forward, right? If you're sitting around being like, I deal with anxiety, I deal with depression, I shouldn't deal with it, I'm afraid to talk about it and all that, you are stuck because you're not allowing yourself to make any changes, right? You're not allowing yourself to talk to other people, get those insights that they may have and all that. Once you get to the point of saying like, I don't care. Like, yes, I don't want to experience anxiety. It stinks, but I don't care that I'm in this position. The most important thing is that I find my way out of it. That's when you actually start making progress, and you are holding yourself back until you do that.
I love that. Where can people find you? Where can they get your books?
Getoutofyourhead.com, all one word.
Perfect. Amazing. Brian, thank you so much. You are so insightful, so knowledgeable. I loved talking to you. You provided so much. I appreciate you so much.
Thank you, Sarah.